Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture over another one of the disputed letters of Paul. In this case, we're going to look at Ephesians, and of course, writing in the wake of the apostle. Is this Paul or is this somebody pretending to be him after his death? So look a little bit at the author, the date, and the audience for Ephesians. If Ephesians was written by Paul, then it was written during the years of 56 to 62 CE/AD, same time period as Colossians, and there's a major reason for that. We'll see the reason for that a little bit. But if it's not written by Paul, then then the letter would have been written at the end of the first century into the early second century of CE/AD. And the audience was to a Gentile Christian community in Ephesus. So, is this Paul? Well, like Colossians, the writing style is different from Paul's undisputed letters. Consider Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. So, what's the deal with Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14? Well, they form one long sentence. Nothing wrong with that per se, but that's not how Paul wrote in the undisputed letters. And I'll mention how modern English translations have tried to, edit that by putting in periods and whatnot. But if you look at it in the original Greek, it's one long sentence. And, in of itself, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not the way that Paul wrote in the undisputed letters. Now, is that a slam dunk that it's not him? No. It's like what I mentioned in the lecture over Colossians with the different genres relating to Stephen King, where Stephen King is known for writing horror suspense novels, but he did write a medieval fantasy novel. So it's not like he can only write in one genre. So you have something similar here with Paul, but also, perhaps more strongly, is that like Colossians, are the writing style differences due because the work was written by a scribe? So I'm going to read here from the ending of Ephesians. So that you also may know how I am and what I am doing, Tychicus will tell you everything. He is a dear brother and faithful minister in the Lord. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, to let you know how we are and to encourage your hearts. Well, that's very, very similar to Colossians. And in this case, that Tychicus may be the actual writer, the scribe, you could say, of Ephesians, and Paul is dictating it. And that could explain the differences in the writing style. But look a little bit more here. Some of the contents of Ephesians and some of the questions, though, related to the contents. Did Paul ever live among the passions of the flesh? Let me try to explain this point with a personal example. I have mentioned in a number of my videos that I am a person of faith, but there was a time period, 11 years in my life, where I was essentially away from the church. While I maintained a lot of the cultural aspects of it. And, I didn't engage in a life of debauchery, you could say, but religious life or things related to the church was not among my priorities. I would say that fact, thinking of Richard Dawkins' scale, Richard Dawkins, who's well known for promoting the cause of atheism, but in his work, The God Delusion, he creates the 7-point scale, where if you're at point one, you absolutely believe that there's a God, and if you're at point seven, you absolutely hold that there is no God. And I probably was among a three at that time, which would have put me as a weak theist. But eventually, I did come back to the faith. Okay, now I use that example and I want to compare it now with Paul. Among Paul's writings, do you have anything similar? The short answer is no. Before Paul's conversion experience on the road to Damascus, he essentially lived, as he stated among his writings, as a law observant Jew. So, unless Paul lived some type of life that he didn't talk about in his writings, we don't have any evidence of him living among the passions of the flesh. And another one that stands out to me even more strongly, a reference to the Torah, in this case, one of the Ten Commandments, as something to be acted upon. Only a handful of times when I've taught either this course or my Religions of the World, and I mention the attitude of Paul regarding the Torah, it's very rare that someone asks me the question, if Paul holds that the death of Christ did away with the Torah, the Jewish law, then why do we as Christians still maintain the Ten Commandments? And here's the meaning behind that question. The Ten Commandments are just but 10 of the 613 laws within Judaism. And of course, contemporary Jews cannot follow all of those 613 commandments or laws because a lot of them related to the temple system, the temple cult, and there is no longer a temple. But if we take Paul to the letter, certainly in the letter to the Galatians and Romans, then the Ten Commandments would be among those that would not be followed as well. But why are they? Well, kind of have to look for a minute of Paul and the Ten Commandments. So this is looking at Paul within his writings. He does condemn idolatry numerous times, such as in the letter to the Galatians and also Romans and many other letters. So with how Jewish people number the commandments, different groups number them differently. The form that you see dominant in this part of the world would be the non-Lutheran Protestant form, but different groups do number them differently. But how the Jewish people number them, the references to idolatry would be essentially commandments 1 and 2. Paul, he doesn't explicitly mention the Sabbath in his writings, but in the book of Acts, he does celebrate the Eucharist on the Lord's Day. Now, the Lord's Day would be a reference to Sunday, which is essentially the day of the resurrection. And so Christians would gather together to celebrate the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, during this time period. Eventually, the Sabbath for Christians was moved up one day from what it was among the Jewish people, whereas among the Jewish people, the Sabbath would begin um, at dusk on Friday and then go all day Saturday. And Christians eventually moved it up one day where it would begin Saturday at dusk and then go all day Sunday. So that's not exactly the Jewish Sabbath, but you can make a case that's pretty close. You have condemnations to adultery, murder, stealing, and coveting in the letter to the Romans. I'm very certain that it's in the letter to the Romans, and I didn't do a search on this before I'm recording this video, where Paul makes the statement about how he would not have known not to covet if the law did not tell him, not to covet. But basically, he mentions, how you're not supposed to covet, and he's referencing the commandment, one of the 10 commandments for doing so. While it's a disputed letter, that of course would be Ephesians that we're looking at. Ephesians mentions not to bear false witness, not to lie, and to honor your parents, which is the reference of Ephesians that I mentioned earlier. So, of the 10 commandments, of course, different groups number them differently, but of them, the only one Paul doesn't mention is not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. He doesn't mention that one in any of his writings, whether you want to look at undisputed writings or disputed writings. And of course, I mentioned in his writings, he doesn't mention the Sabbath, but you can make a close argument for the celebration of the Eucharist on the Lord's Day in Acts, which he takes part of. And one other point here is that the Ten Commandments were possibly a compromise Peter made between James and Paul. Of course, James, Jesus' brother slash kinsman, he is shown as being someone, maintaining a lot of the ways of the Torah. And of course, Paul is more radical in essentially, holding the view that Jesus did away with the entire Torah. So Peter perhaps was kind of a middle ground, between James and Paul, where Peter's like, okay, we can disregard 603 commandments of the law, but let's maintain the first 10. Now, a Jewish person would not agree with that. They would find that to be a violation of Deuteronomy chapter 13. But Christian theology regarding Jesus and Paul obviously, brings questions to that. But in any case, it's possible that the Ten Commandments being maintained by Christians was a compromise that Peter made between James, who in the writings that we have, particularly in the book of Acts, is, shown maintaining a lot of the rituals, a lot of the commandments of the Torah, where, of course, Paul, in his attitude, is that the death of Christ did away with all the Torah, and Peter's like, okay, let's maintain the first 10, but the other 603 we can disregard. So, anyway, that's essentially all that we have for the letter to the Ephesians. So, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Till then, take care.